Today I am going to discuss the basics of postcolonialism with you all. The main purpose is again to give you all a clear idea so that you all have a strong foundation of literary theory and criticism. Now, the word postcolonialism, on account of the presence of the word post, may create an impression of being something that comes after colonialism. But well, it's not so. It is more of a kind of movement, a reading tactic. Now, without spending more words on postcolonialism, let's dive first into the details so as to understand why or how it emerged. So let's begin the usual drill. To understand postcolonialism, first you need to understand two words, imperialism and colonialism, and basically their differences. To begin with, the Wikipedia definition of imperialism goes something like this. Imperialism is a policy or ideology of extending the rule over people and other countries for extending political and economic access, power and control, often through employing hard power, especially military force, but also soft power. Now, the hard power that we got in the definition is something that is reflected through colonialism. For colonialism is only one form of practice which results from the ideology of imperialism and specifically concerns the settlement of one group of people in a new location. So if you think deeply and look around, then you will realize that imperialism is present even today. Say for instance, the bossing of America is what can be called as modern day imperialism. So having discussed these two concepts, I'll move on to the influences behind postcolonialism. They are number 1, Commonwealth literature, and number 2, theories of colonial discourse that influenced the academia in the second half of the 20th century. So let's first discuss the first influence that came out of Commonwealth. In the screen you can see the nations that form what is called as the Commonwealth of Nations. Look close and you will get a similarity. They are the nations that were once British colonies. Historically speaking, the Commonwealth dates back to the first half of the 20th century when the decolonization of the British Empire through increased self-governance of its territories began. Thus you can see that in it there's hidden a kind of affiliation and also the haunting presence of the colonial past, and hence also of the colonizer. Now moving into Commonwealth literature, it needs no further explanation that it is the literature that came out of these nations. Commonwealth literature as a separate category emerged in and around 1950. It is the name given to the literature in English, emerging from a selection of countries with a history of colonialism. Say for instance, African literature or Caribbean literature or South Asian literature in English, they all fell under the category of Commonwealth literature. And the reason of the categorization was to identify and locate and consider via a common concerns and attributes that these manifold literary voices might have. Now, so you can well see, though none of the nations were then a colony, but the homogenization and the othering continued in a Latin form. The emphasis was for a common voice for similarity. So soon it was found out that this categorization was problematic. The first problem was that the Commonwealth promoted unity in diversity, but the plural term Commonwealth literatures were rarely used, and hence the diversity went ignored. The second problem is related to the first. Commonwealth literature dealt with a sense of national and cultural identity, though of course it had universal concerns too, especially the best of writings, but in reading them, the national and cultural identity were considered secondary, and so they were read in relation to canonical English literature. This bracketing, thinking retrospectively, is not justified or valid. This takes us to the third problem. The third problem was that since it derived its name from British Commonwealth of Nations, which referred initially to the dominions and then to the sovereign nations. Thus, in the use of the word Commonwealth, it seemed that the texts were addressed primarily to a Western English-speaking readership, which thus had an imperious connotation. So ultimately, what came as a revelation was that a paradox sits at the heart of the Commonwealth. For on one hand, it denotes free association of equal nations, and on the other hand, it connotes to the shared history of colonization that has a haunting effect. Having discussed the issue with Commonwealth as a categorization, now I'll move on to the theories of colonial discourse. Now first let me explain what the theories of colonial discourses do, or what is their purpose. They explored the ways that representation and mode of perceptions are used as fundamental weapons of colonial power to keep colonized people subservient to colonial rule. They point our attention, or they direct our attention to the fact that colonization is not just composed of oppression, subjugation and ruling, but is constructed out of the justification that goes with it, made primarily out of the ways of seeing or white man's gaze. So now let's explore some of the important theorists who propounded these ideas. The first name is of Franz Fannin. Fanon was a psychologist. He witnessed French colonialism and he explained his experience and the phenomenon of colonialism in psychological terms. In his book Black Skin, White Mask, published in the year 1952, he psychoanalyzes the oppressed black person who is perceived to be a lesser creature and peculiar in the white world due to skin color. He refers to his experience when, in France, derogatory phrases like dirty nigger or look a negro were used for him. He points at the defining of identity in negative terms by those in power. Thus, he writes about how the colonized is forced to see himself not as a subject but as object, which leads to a split in the very sense of self. The colonized is denied the right to define his identity and internalizes the self as other. As a response to the trauma, the other attempts to internalize the ways of the colonizer, but they are never accepted on equal terms and exist only as black skin, white mask. The second theorist in this context is Edward Scythe, and without him the discussion on postcolonialism can never be complete. Scythe was a professor of literature at Columbia University, a public intellectual, and a founder of the academic field of postcolonial studies. In his book Orientalism, published in the year 1978, he presents the divisive relationship between the colonizer and the colonized, with emphasis to the colonizer. He writes about the production of knowledge and about the locations they dominated, not by trying to learn from the natives, but based on the commonly held Eurocentric assumptions about the Orient as a mythic place of exoticism, moral laxity, sexual degeneracy, etc. Thus, Orientalism refers to the sum of West's representation of the Orient. The main point that Scythe makes here are: number one, Orientalism constructs binary. Say for instance, East-West, Orient-Occident, which reflects an unequal dichotomy by the repetition of stereotypes. Stereotypically, the Orient or the East is considered as unchanging, strange, having transgressive gender identity. Assumptions are also made about racial characteristics, say for instance, lazy Indians, violent Arabs, etc. The Orient is also considered as feminine, for the Orient is exotic, sexually mysterious, submissive, tempting. Secondly, Orientalism is a Western fantasy, which connotes to the fact that it's fabricated. Thirdly, Orientalism is an institution. This implies that the imaginative assumptions of Orientalism are often taken as hard facts. Using reason, it had recruited science and history to serve its ends. Say for instance, the first Western version of Indian history was written by James Mill, and here he presents his harsh attacks on Hindu customs as a backward culture, which he claims to be notable only for superstition, ignorance, and the mistreatment of women. The fourth point that Scythe makes here is that Orientalism is literary, which implies that it influences or influenced literary and non-literary writings. Fifthly, he introduces the concepts of latent Orientalism and manifest Orientalism in context of manifestation of Orientalism. Latent view remains the same and works as a blueprint for the manifest Orientalism, which is made of dreams and fantasies about the Orient. Now, Scythe became an established cultural critic with the book Orientalism, and with the popularity of Orientalism in the 1980s, three forms of textual analysis became popular. The first is rereading canonical English literature so as to see whether they perpetuated, supported, or were critical and questioned assumptions of colonial discourses. The second was post-structuralist inquiry into the representation of colonial subjects. The third was reading of the new literature from countries with a history of colonialism. The primary argument was that the texts were primarily concerned with writing back to the center and hence were engaged in the act of decolonizing the mind. Thus, we are back again to the point from where we began, that is Commonwealth literature. As a result of the above interventions, Commonwealth literature became postcolonial literature, for the shift was from reading of common strain towards diversity. Local concerns became fundamental to the meaning and not of secondary importance. And finally, in the 1990s, postcolonialism or postcolonial theory entered into the premise of literature and criticism. Thus, postcolonialism does not mean after colonialism, but recognizes historical continuity and change. On one hand, it acknowledges the material realities and modes of representation common to colonialism are still very much with us today. On the other hand, it asserts the promise, the possibility, and the continuing necessity of change, while also recognizing that important challenges and changes have already been achieved. Now, Carol Boyce Davis, in her book Black Women Writing and Identity, published by Routledge in the year 1994, argues that we must remember the numerous people that are still existing in a colonial relationship around the world. Thus, colonialism may have stopped, but colonial relationships still exist. Thus, finally, to sum up, it can be said, postcolonial theory is a method of interpreting, reading, and critiquing the cultural practices of colonialism, where it proposes that the exercise of colonial power is also the exercise of racially determined powers of representation. Thus, in reading a text, the concerns that come out of the lens of postcolonial theory are mainly binary construction, stereotype and its reversal, mimicry wherever applicable, hybridity and ambivalence, representation and power. So that brings us to the end of today's discussion. Thank you all for watching.